on behalf of the global corporate interests to find out how and why the space program will be used to fight all future wars on Earth and from space. It's important to go back in time to understand how the public has been misled about the origins and true purpose of the space program.
If we really want to understand what's going on in space today and what's happening with the plan to put weapons in space, I think it's instructive to go back and understand the origins of the U.S. space program. And to do that, you have to go back to Nazi Germany. Hitler recruited a brilliant young rocket scientist by the name of Wernher von Braun, who had a weekend rocket club, to come to work for the Nazis to build the V-1 and V-2 rockets that were used to terrorize the cities of London and Paris and Brussels towards the end of World War II. And for von Braun and his team, they set up along the Baltic Sea a place called Peenemünde. It was a research and development center for the Nazi rocket operation. And to this place at Peenemünde, the Nazis brought thousands of Jews and French resistance fighters to serve as prisoners, essentially slaves, to build this production effort. Well, the British found out about it, went in and bombed the entire operation. And so the Nazis said, we've got to move to a more secure location. And down inside of central Germany, there's a mountain chain called the Harz Mountains. And in that mountain, there's a huge tunnel where the Nazis were storing military hardware. Well, they cleared the whole thing out, moved the entire rocket operation into the tunnel, named it Mittelwerk. And just outside the mountain tunnel at Mittelwerk, the Nazis built a brand new concentration camp called Dora. And to Dora, the Nazis brought 40,000 Jews, gypsies, French resistance fighters, homosexuals, communists, even a black American GI were brought there to serve as slaves for the operation. Well, inside the mountain tunnel, the slaves began to sabotage the operation. They left screws unturned. They urinated on the wires, so that when von Braun and his team were launching the rockets, they were going haywire. And so they sent their team in to find out who was doing this. They identified 100 of the slaves and summarily hung them in front of everyone as a warning that you will not interfere with this operation. Well, eventually the Allies even closed in on this place too. And on the day that they did, von Braun and his team fled for the hills, knowing that if they were captured here, they would be accused of crimes against humanity. One of the first to arrive at this place was an 18-year-old American GI by the name of Hugh Carey, who later became governor in New York State. And he said when they arrived, what they discovered lying at their feet was thousands and thousands and thousands of dead bodies. And come to find out, 25,000 of the 40,000 slaves at this place perished at the hands of the Nazis. Well, you know, immediately after the war, the U.S. and the Allies created the Nuremberg trials, at which time we brought the Nazis to justice for their crimes against humanity. But 1,500 of the top Nazis never went to trial. They were smuggled into the United States by the U.S. military under a program called Operation Paperclip, smuggled in through Boston and West Palm Beach, Florida. And Wernher von Braun and his rocket team, 100 of them, along with 100 copies of the V-2 rocket, were sent to Huntsville, Alabama, where von Braun became the first director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. What's interesting is the other 1,400 Nazis. Who were they? Well, some of them were brought to the United States to work for the CIA. Others were brought to the United States to do the LSD drug experiments and the MK Ultra mind experiments during the 1960s, where people were jumping out of windows. Some of the Nazi scientists that in Germany had been taking Jews and putting them in freezing temperatures to see how the body would react to that were sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio and were put in charge of the U.S. military flight medicine program. And so when you take 1,500 of the top Nazi scientists and essentially seed the military-industrial complex. The question I have is, do they bring with them an ideological contamination? Well, not only did von Braun go to work for NASA, but the guy that was in charge of the V2 flight test program up at Peenemünde along the Baltic Sea, a guy by the name of Kurt Diebes, became the first director of the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And then the man that recruited von Braun, Major General Walter Dornberger, the guy that was sent by Hitler to recruit von Braun to come to work for the Nazis, he became vice president of Bell Aerosystems Corporation in New York that made its riches building the helicopters for the war in Vietnam. In fact, when NASA was created, the U.S. military freaked out. You're going to have a civilian space program? You can't do that. The military has to be in charge of space. Oh, don't worry, don't worry, the military was told. From the first day, we're going to have a NASA oversight committee that ensures that the Pentagon controls the space program. And Major General Walter Dornberger, the Nazi that recruited von Braun, was appointed to that NASA oversight committee. In fact, in 1958, Dornberger testified before the United States Congress, saying that America's top space priorities should be to, quote, conquer, occupy, keep, and utilize space between the Earth and the Moon. And in fact, later on, in a speech before a national missile industry conference, Dornberger told the assembled, "Gentlemen, I didn't come to this country to lose the Third World War. I lost two already." And then finally, the man that was in charge of production and middle work inside the mountain tunnel there in Germany, Arthur Rudolph, he became the first project director of the NASA Saturn V rocket program that took the United States to the moon. So these are the essential origins of the U.S. space program. And so when we hear this slogan, Master of Space, that is on the building of the U.S. Space Command headquarters in Colorado Springs at Peterson Air Force Base, do we not find an ideological similarity between Master of Space and Hitler's slogan, Deutschland über alles, Germany over all?
Featured book this episode is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card.
Yeah, this book actually is a fiction book, a science fiction book, and we decided to bring it in, get away from all of the super intense, crazy books we've been showing you guys, and give you something fun to read, but you'll still learn something from. It's essentially, in the future, it's a story about a young boy who is essentially genetically engineered by the military to be a military genius. He's a third of 3 different children who were all designed the same way, but the first 2 basically had faults, and so they ended up bringing him in, and he's been designed to try and go after this alien race which is threatening planet Earth.
Yeah, and actually the families are only supposed to have 2 children, and actually we got a excerpt from the book about that.
Yeah, it talks about how the depopulation program is working under the world government.
Yeah, because the kid Ender gets discriminated against because he's a third, so he's like an abomination.
Yeah, they've even like put it into the mindset of people. So it says, they were born religious, you know. Your father was baptized with the name John Paul Wiskorczek, Catholic, the 7th of 9 children. 9 children? That was unthinkable. Criminal. Yes, well, people do strange things for religion. You know the sanctions, Ender. They were not as harsh then, but still not easy. Only the first 2 children had a free education. Taxes steadily rose with each new child. Your father turned 16 and invoked the Non-Complying Families Act to separate himself from his family. He changed his name, renounced his religion, and vowed never to have more than the allotted 2 children. All the shame and persecution he went through as a child, he vowed no child of his would go through it. No one wants a third anymore. You can't expect them to be glad, but your father and mother are a special case. They both renounced their religions. Your mother was a Mormon, but in fact their feelings are still ambiguous. They're ashamed of having come from non-compliant families. They conceal it to the degree that your mother refuses to admit to anyone that she was born in Utah, lest they suspect. Your father denies his Polish ancestry, since Poland is still a non-compliant nation and under international sanction because of it.
So yeah, definitely a whole lot of stuff implied there about this future reality in this fictional book.
The geopolitics of the world in the future.
So this part of the book right here is where they're convincing him to go to the battle school. How will you do that, one asks. I'll lie to him, the other responds. And if that doesn't work, then I'll tell the truth. We're allowed to do that in emergencies. We can't plan for everything, you know.
Yeah, it's funny the way they manipulate him throughout the entire book. Basically, it's these adults that are, running his life. He's just a child, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old throughout the book. And he's basically being run by these adults and being manipulated. But to an extent understands that he's being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
Now, later in the book, his siblings, as we had said, they didn't get chosen to go to these battle schools, but they stay back on Earth, essentially, and still very intelligent, more than your average person, and they get onto the internet, essentially, onto the nets, and they put out fake personas of themselves, Locke and Demosthenes, and they, old political writers, of course, and so they name themselves this and put out writings discussing world politics, and this is a part of the book where they're discussing them. It says, they've become quite deft at sifting accurate information out of the stories of the hopelessly ignorant, gullible news writers, the news herd, as Peter called them.
Yeah, that's pretty much implying, this concept of the sheeple. They're swayed easily by what's promoted through the propaganda outlets and whatnot. If you trust everything you read or you're given through the tube and whatnot, how you can turn out.
And still how intelligent people could actually sift through that stuff to pick out the little bits of good information to find out what's really happening.
Which is what we're trying to do for you guys.
Which is what we do on this show. So.
Yes. Anyways, next up, speaking of news herd, we have sometimes lies were more dependable than the truth. It's indeed quite convenient sometimes, easier to believe a lie than to believe in what's really happening, to face that.
Everybody thinks Hitler got to power because of his armies, because they were willing to kill. And that's partly true, because in the real world, power is always built on the threat of death and dishonor. But mostly he got to power on words, on the right words at the right time.
Like Jordan Maxwell, one of my favorite researchers and authors, says if you put S before words, it becomes swords, and he says it's because words are cutting. Moving on though, next little excerpt we have here is Ender talking about fighting with a bully and his little gang of bullies that pick on him all the time because he's a third. He's thinking to himself, I have to win this now and for all time, or I'll fight it every day and it will get worse and worse.
Yeah, and that's kind of like everybody's struggle against this new world order power that's being built up, who are trying to set up their own little form of world government and domination over the population. If we don't stop this right now in its tracks, us and our future generations are going to be living in absolute prison lockdown scientific dictatorship type of a planet.
This next excerpt here is about him, Ender, talking to another boy at the battle school. He's been put in charge of his own platoon and has been quite successful. And he's basically being given a cold shoulder and scolded by all the other boys. And so one of them comes up and tells him, if anyone deserves a cheer, it's you. But that's life. Make them eat dust. Ender responds, I'll try. Car and Carby left, and Ender mentally added him to his private list of people who also qualified as human beings.
Yeah, because he's dealing this whole time in his childhood, basically with some of the worst-minded people or the most competitive people or most deceptive people on the planet. And so, he has a very short list of people he can actually trust and who considers to be, real humans.
So please check out Ender's Game. It's actually part 1 of a 4-part series. And it goes into thousands of years in the future, involves light travel and different time passing relative to space travel. I mean, it's mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah, definitely an interesting book. Go check it out. Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card.
Yeah, escape reality into a different science fiction tyranny.